Hello.
Hello, Josh. How are you?
I'm fine. It's nice to meet you, Dr. Masumi.
Good to see you. Just feel free to call me Essie.
It's nice to meet you. So I'm Joshua Butler, the East Point City Councilman, and I've read your bio and I'm thoroughly impressed. How about you giving a brief description of your bio for everybody who's going to tune in to this video at some point in the future?
Josh, it's my pleasure to meet you. I've looked forward to this. So I am very briefly. I work at Emory University, professor of economics, and I'm an econometrician. So I deal with a lot of statistics, deal with economic theory, history, and model building with the use of evidence as comes from data. So it's very quantitative rather than narrative and philosophical. I'm interested in history and narrative out of personal interest rather than my immediate skill set as an econometrician. I have a special interest in income inequality and wealth inequality and poverty. One of the few people who started this business of looking at people's well-being and going beyond just income. It would mean education, health, public services, security, all of the aspects that impact a person's life seems to me as very important. And so it's not just income. As a little bit of background to what I anticipate our conversation would be, my reasons for becoming interested in this what's called multidimensional well-being other than income is that I've lived under many different systems, economic systems, political systems, and I could see the variance in terms of society's approach to how it provides for people and how people participate in the market. I could see the Europeans, for instance, provide a lot of basic network and services. Income isn't everything. There is a lot of security in terms of health, retirement, and so on. Whereas ours is based on maybe getting the income to people and then letting them compete for all these other services in the free market. Mm-hmm. So the mechanism is so incredibly different. Here, you could take income as a reflection of what you could do with respect to other dimensions of life. Whereas in other societies, these would be provided separately as much as possible. So income inequality means a lot when you talk about it in the US, because you can't have law, you can't hire lawyers, you can't have justice, you don't have health insurance, you don't have housing, you don't have retirement if you don't have good income. That is not so in many of the otherwise culturally similar societies in Western Europe. Who are not communists or not socialists, who do provide for these different dimensions. So income isn't everything. So my purpose in that area is to bring about these dimensions and measure in a way, how well-being is distributed, received by people in different segments, by gender, by race, by locality, and so on, rather than just income. So because of that, from early age, early in my career, I've been very interested in these aspects of justice, welfare, and distribution of outcomes, whatever they may be. And so that's something in which I've informed my work with statistics and econometrics. That's the sense in which those two things come together in my work.
Well, I think your work is very important and it's very relevant to the conversation we're having today. because what you can bring in terms of the numbers is a historic view of where the economy was and inequality statistically before the pandemic. And as we shape this conversation, we could talk about what happens after the COVID-19 pandemic and how it statistically affects wealth inequality, income inequality, and we can compare and contrast the two. So do you want to go into a brief historical background in recent history about what our economy looked like before the pandemic?
By all means. Rather a mixed picture, bipolar. We have the financial sector, markets, stock markets, asset prices versus production, labor, and other sectors of the economy. So just before the virus hit, we had the lowest unemployment figures in about 50 years. That's meaningful. A lot of people have found jobs. The only qualification is that unemployment figures count only people who are looking for a job but can't find it, or on unemployment pay. A lot of people after the financial crisis in 2000 and 2009 never got back into the job market. So there is an effective rate of unemployment that has been in the 9 and 10%, even though the official rate is 3. Those rates are especially meaningful for relatively older people. So if you're 50 and got laid off in 2009, you never got back. You just didn't have the skill sets to get back. And also the minorities are especially affected. The rates of unemployment among the minorities is always twice or higher than the national levels. And that again qualified by the difference between the unemployment rate and the effective rate. The effective rate is very, very high. So in terms of what that means to the economic outcome, as I like to look at the distribution of it, a tale of two cities. The asset prices in terms of the stock market, stock prices, housing and other assets, capital value, has reached the highs that we've never seen in history. In real terms, these values are unheard of in human history, massive amounts. But then the distribution of it is incredibly skewed. Only 2 or 3 times in recorded history, in recent history, by recent I mean 100 years or so, have we had this level of concentration of capital and income going to capital. So we think of the social output and who gets it, and capital gets some, labor gets some. We've never had this much going to capital as ever in history. There are some periods that are similar to this, and that's ominous because they're the 1930s concentrations of wealth, which led to the collapse of the system, the Big Depression, and the wars that ensued because of that. So I think incomes had not been rising in real terms for several decades. Bernie Sanders is fond of quoting how real incomes had not changed for many decades, and that's true. Statistically, that is factual. Whereas return to capital, return to assets had multiplied. An example being, if you had $100,000 in the stock market in 2010, just after the crash, during Obama administration, by February, you had 250% raise, increased return. If you did pretty much nothing, if you put in passive funds, you didn't have to be brilliant to do that. 250% is more than 3 times. And big money begets big money. And right. so that's the level of concentration that we had by about February, just before the COVID and lockdowns and so on. But in terms of asset prices, unemployment rate, GDP, real good, as good as ever. In terms of how it was distributed and what are the different parts of the economy that contributes to that, a lot of underlying weakness. I'll mention one other thing. Consumption has been about 70% of the US economy. That means manufacturing and other sections of the economy have become smaller. Manufacturing is now 11%. That means capital and manufacturing has gone somewhere else. And that has long-term consequences. Imagine if you're a household and all you do is consume, but you're not producing anything. You can borrow, live on credit for a long time. At some point, the gig is up. And that's the sense in which the underlying economy with this massive asset price bubble did not look very good at all. That's why economists disagree. But whether we had a good economy in the last 3 or 4 years, or even 6, 7 years. So historically, that's kind of the background. Some of these levels are ominously similar to the 30s before the crash of 29 and 1933 is where the Depression began. And social cohesion is lost when that happens. People behave badly and wars begin because people compete for resources and they're unhappy about what's happening in their national economies. So that affects people's livelihood. That affects young people's lives, people who have to serve, who lose their loved ones and so on. So these have incredibly deep social consequences. When the economy behaves in extreme fashion, the consequences spill over beyond the economy. With the lockdown and the basically stoppage in world trade and activity, it could not have happened at the worst time. Because I personally liken the economy just before the virus to a plane that is avoiding bad weather and storms. It keeps going higher and higher. And no plane is really happy beyond 45,000 feet. Our plane was flying at 60,000 feet and couldn't afford even bad company reports. At the end of a quarter, if a company didn't report that it's going to grow by 30% next quarter, its price will go down by 20%. That's how sensitized it was. Suddenly we have a massive jolt, a massive shock. With the unemployment now, Friday, 14.7, the official rate, the prospective unemployed is 22%, the one I described, the true unemployment rate. And over 20 million laid off just in April.
Right.
And that's coming at a really bad time. I know you have questions about insolvency and liquidity and so on. And the scenario, the picture I'm drawing for you in terms of the timing of this disaster, it does not paint a very optimistic picture of what could happen to liquidity and defaults and bankruptcies and so on. I'm sure we get into that a little bit later.
I think that your definition and the precursor to the pandemic is interesting when you say that manufacturing is only 11% of our economy, with 70% of that is consumption. And if we were thinking that 70% of it's consumption, with the majority of those products being produced overseas or in China.
Yes. Yes.
It reminds me of a little known fact, when Ross Perot was running for president against Bill Clinton and George Bush Sr., he talked about the globalization of an economy, and not until you have this equal terms pay that we will get jobs back in America. And so does this coincide with the fact that labor prices have not increased, salaries have not increased, but with the global economy, so to speak, that labor costs has been reduced and asset values have been increased? Because I'll lead to that question. It seems to me fundamental. I studied economics at Morehouse College. I have a minor in economics. And so when you look at factors like oil prices being at record lows, in fact, going into the negatives for a day, and then you look at record numbers of unemployment, traditionally, we're taught that this brings a lowering of the equity markets and an increase in the bond markets. But we're finding that's just an opposite today. So what's going on and why is that happening?
So there is a number of issues, very important issues that you've raised. One is this deflation that has been going on at the same time that we've had asset price bubbles. This is one of my peeve subjects. We've taught our students, as you know, for years about the what's good about mobility. And we've assumed in all of our economic teaching and theories about a perfect capital mobility, which was never true. In the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's truly become mobile. Capital will go where it can marry the cheapest labor. When capital was being brought to the US settlement time, it didn't have cheap labor. What did it do? It went and kidnapped people and took slavery to the mass level that it became. It was bringing cheap labor to capital in massive numbers. And that went on obviously for a couple of centuries. We'd never had this level because of nationalism, because of technology, because of transportation, different transportation means and so on, different financial system. We never had mobile capital in the way we do now. Today, a car is made in Detroit, but maybe 80% made in China. Apple is 90% made in China, but it's an American product. These make it very difficult for even economists, let alone lay people, to understand what's being made by whom. And to your point, labor has become cheap because we've taken capital to totally new labor, who is the modern version of slavery. You get, I don't know, $5 to $10 a day to produce an iPhone in China. And that thing sells for $1,200. There is a lot of intermediary charging and money making going on. The guy who distributes it makes many times more than the guy that is putting together the phone. That level of competition, 1.4 billion Chinese, 1.3 billion Indians who've been trained and now part of the labor force in our planet. Southeast Asia, parts of Southern America, including Mexico. These are massive supply of very, very cheap labor, very compliant, very poorly paid, very poorly secured in terms of retirement, in terms of health provision, in terms of rights and so on. So the very system we had 300 years ago is now in place at a much bigger scale. And we don't see it because it's not happening within our shores, somewhere else. That is to me, the biggest explanation of price deflation everywhere in terms of commodities and labor and food and a lot of other things. There's some aspects of this that are fantastic. We all go to Costco and fill up two massive dollies and for a couple of $100. So there are benefits to consumption. It's not without benefit. There have been, those are the reasons it's sold so well. But in terms of being able to maintain this, we've become pure consumers. 70% of the economy become consumption. And we have some human capital in terms of technology and so on. But that's being fast, in a way, replaced by the same level of human capital, the skill sets outside. So that's not really sustainable. And it benefits only the very rich in any case. So in terms of sustainability, we've been in trouble for some time. You mentioned oil. Oil is just another commodity, and we found incredible new ways of producing it in massive quantities. This fracking is a bigger revolution than people have been told. It's expensive and it's very costly to the environment. So it needs an oil price at a certain level for it to be financially viable. Most people who've gotten involved in it are into financial gains as much as production of oil, which is why they're so sensitive about what happens to Saudi prices or what do the Russians and Saudis do. They're leveraged to their forehead. It's a financial gain. They have to have a return to their investment that is immediate. Servicing that debt puts a pressure on that system. Otherwise, it's one of the most incredibly well-hidden new revolutions in technology. When you do it well in regular oil, it has to be sold. It has to be stored. It comes out. There's no way of really controlling it. So there's an immediacy to it, there's a pressure. When you do fracking, they go miles into the ground, but you have to control where to open the tap. So you can control the market in terms of supply. And this is an incredible power, except that it costs so much. Except when you borrowed money to do that, you have to deliver. It's not a technological pressure. So it's a very complicated market. It has some old players, like the state players, Russia, OPEC, Saudi Arabia. And it has some old oil companies that are invested this way, which have a different set of interests than the ones that haven't. And there's a power play going on between all of them. And the suppliers, the consumer and the supplier group has changed. US is now one of the biggest producers, maybe the biggest. And what this means in terms of the oil market in the world and geopolitics is remarkable, because China is a massive importer, the way we were, the way Europeans were. And that has impacted our attitude about, and will impact our attitude about what to do with the Middle East, for instance. What are our interests? What are the interests of our allies in Europe? Do we let them to fend for themselves? Russians are the biggest producer of regular oil. If we let the Europeans become dependent on Russia, the geopolitics of that would mean a totally new world order. And so oil prices are incredibly complex. There's a commodity involved. There's a massive financial, technological, geopolitical issues involved in it as well. So it's very hard to tell at any given time. With the economic activity in China shutting down for a while, they couldn't store oil anymore. The storages were full. The price never went negative. It's this complex thing. It's the derivative prices, it's the contracts that became worthless and negative because if you put a contract and it was delivered, you had no place to store the oil. So, and so that's why the prices went negative for a short period of time. The price of oil will depend on how we get out of COVID economically. And I know that's probably going to be a big topic for us to talk about because it involves a lot of projections and guesses, right? But we can get to that as you please.
So let's talk about COVID. Earlier in our conversation, you know, a lot of people, especially novices, want to try to compare COVID to the Spanish flu of 1918. But it looks like the economics is more closely to the Great Depression of the 1929 crash in the 30s based upon unemployment numbers and things like that. Would you say that's true or?
Yes. So in terms of two separate things. So the pandemic will likely have the same kind of impact and going into quarantine, shutting down economies, tends to have the same impact economically if the economy is in the same place. Medically speaking, in terms of characteristics of the pandemic, so far and unfortunately going forward, the two cases are very similar. The attitudes about it, what people went through, because it happened during the war.
Right.
It was in the middle of a war. And now we have this pressure to do well economically. Then the massive pressure was to keep the war going. You were in the middle of a war. So the reluctance to accept what quarantine meant. Then it meant shutting the war. Now it means shutting the financial climb. The price bubble is in danger. So we started ignoring it. The first wave of the pandemic behaved very much like it has so far with this one. We thought declared victory. We had to start sending soldiers to the front. The second wave and the third wave were true killers. The estimates are incredible, and these are all just estimates. We're talking millions of people, but a big dent in the world population. So medically, the chances of them being very similar is very high because the dirty little secret of medicine is we still don't have a successful vaccine for flu because it keeps mutating. Every year you have it for last year, it doesn't work, so you have to get another one. This is more serious than a flu. So economically, with the other one, we were coming out of a war and ready for a big expansion, getting into fiscal stimulus, as it were, the mother of all fiscal stimuluses. And so we got into an expansion, changing a war economy into a consumer economy. The energy was there, the discipline is there, and everything turns into that incredible, glorious time of the 1920s. All kinds of inventions, radios, and so on and so on. Cars became mass-produced, utilities, appliances, and so on. So the economy boomed. Even though the stock market was way ahead of it and crashed, there was a price bubble. There's lots of speculation, but it was based on a real expanding economy and manufacturing, consumption, all over the world, but especially in the US. This one comes on top of really, in my opinion, a depressed economy manufacturing-wise, but riding a massive asset bubble. It really doesn't have the sort of things that we landed on after the pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu pandemic. There are very few reasons for a lot of the businesses that have shut down to go back and operate in the same way that they did. You mentioned our prior correspondence about the bankruptcies of J.C. Crew and J.C. Penney, Kmart for that matter, lots of other ones. These guys could have declared bankruptcy 10 years ago, 5 years ago. It takes this kind of shock to basically push them over. Retail has been in trouble forever. Every other neighborhood and suburb has a shopping mall, and what goes with that. And you and I go to these shopping malls, and seldom do we see any crowd at the best of times. Now you have people's shopping habits change dramatically. Everyone is online with the Amazons of these worlds, Alibabas of these worlds. Retail, which is a massive employer, is in trouble. Just restaurants and food industry has 5 million unemployed as of April, just that section of consumption. And if retail does not come back to anything like the levels before, and the capital and the entrepreneurs and investors, like other events like this before in history, decide that this is an opportune moment to switch, go somewhere else, something they wanted to do, had to do, couldn't bring themselves to do. Maybe there are loans now, maybe there's more accommodation for that sort of thing now. Maybe bankruptcies will be handled differently. The chance of the economy slimming down, cutting anything that was on the margin in terms of profitability are incredibly high. And the first people to be impacted are the employees of retailers and restaurants and services like that. I don't think we have enough money left to keep producing checks. And that brings us to the most important thing: what's actionable economic policy? The reason for this pressure to reopen is that we really are out of money. The trillions and trillions have been signed off to sources that really mostly didn't need it to keep the bubblish prices, so no one needs to sell, as it were, or they buy back the same stocks.
You're talking at this point. You're talking the $2 trillion tax cut that was given to the corporate class by the
That
Trump.
was the beginning of Trump. Last 3 or 4 weeks, we've had another $2.5 trillion. In one accounting, what the Fed is doing is tougher to account for. Fed is underwriting risk. The Fed is underwriting risk. It's threatened to buy assets of failing big companies. It's never happened before.
So yeah, that's what talk about that, because a lot of people don't understand. Fed usually controls monetary policy through interest rates. So for the first time in history, they're talking about doing high yield or underwriting risk. And so what does that mean? Like they'll pick winners and losers in terms of, tell us about that, because that's a very important fact, but most people are overlooking that.
I think it's huge. It may end up being the controlling thing going forward, and where we are at with that. Because when you have financial resources, you can, buy yourself some time. You can protect people for a while, and that protects the economy and gives it the chance to come back. This was what happened after the war, both wars, world wars. This time, with the 2008 crash, they decided to open the floodgates in terms of flushing asset holders with more cash and more credit to bring back the asset prices to as though there was no bubble. That takes a lot of trillions to do. So, because if we had a bubble in 2008 and you pay it to be maintained, you're protecting a price bubble. You're not letting equilibrium prices. But that costs money. So what the Fed began was to invent new tools and revisit some old tools, which all amount to the same thing, to creating the impression of credit where there is none. So we invented this thing called the Fed's balance sheet. Most people really don't understand that. I talk to a lot of economists who don't get that. Fed is not a bank. Fed does not have money. It shouldn't have a balance sheet. It's a booking design. It's a bookkeeping design. So the Treasury wants to borrow. If it were to flood the market, the Chinese are not buying the treasuries, or Japanese or others are not buying the same rate. This will put the interest rates through the roof, right? So the Fed comes along and says, you know, I'll lend you money. I'll put it on my balance sheet. The balance sheet went to like $6.5 trillion, 2008, 2009. So the Fed is on one side of the street, the Treasury is printing these Treasury bills. On the other side of the street, the Fed is taking them, acting like a buyer, real buyer. What that means is we're printing. We're printing that money. And because at the same time, Fed's role is to deal with interest rates. Unless it does that, the interest rates, supply and demand, right? If someone doesn't want to buy your treasury paper, you have to give them 9%, you have to give them 15%. I had a municipal bond in the early 80s, tax-free for 19.5%. In my own lifetime, I've seen that. That's where these rates ought to be. If you look at supply and demand for borrowing. That was when the US debt was in a few, maybe 3 or 4 trillion. Now it's at $35 trillion. And it has another 100 trillion in commitments in terms of retirements, Social Security, and so on. The Fed is acting, and everyone talking about further stimulus, as though we've saved for all these years, we have money in the bank, and now you say, okay, for a rainy day, this is the rainy day, let's spend what you saved. We don't have any savings. We have debts for the next 3 generations. The biggest, I talked to my British friends who are very concerned about this, the biggest threat to all of what Fed is doing, and this could happen the next time we want to do something that benefits you and I maybe, or other people, working people, fiscal stimulus. Suddenly, Mitch McConnell says, no money. We don't have any money. When they were writing checks for credit to the banks, we had a lot of fake money, that was fine. If you have to build roads or hire people, suddenly we talk about where is that money coming from? So he's talking about cities and municipalities and states declaring bankruptcy. Means he said already, that's his public statement, that there isn't going to be money for that kind of thing.
That brings us to the next point, exactly, with which Mitch McConnell is talking about states and municipalities filing for bankruptcy because the federal government doesn't want to subsidize them. What does
Doesn't
that?
have the money to do it. It didn't have the money last year. Didn't have the money 6 years ago. But as long as that money was going to the banks, they still have this trickle down, and this is being very polite. As long as they believe in this trickle down, as doesn't matter how much money you pay to JP Morgan, JP Morgan knows how to create jobs and employment. Hasn't happened. They keep accumulating and pressing the price of assets up. They're not creating greater manufacturing here. It isn't the real growth in wages here. As long as you believe that, you keep throwing money at those guys so that it will trickle down. There is no historical evidence at all. This is a 19th century idea, this trickle down. It's failed empirically time after time after time. It just doesn't happen. And now they've delayed the fiscal stimulus under all these administrations, especially the last 2 years, thinking that these guys will take care of the real economy by trickle-down mechanism. Now that they're going to talk about what to do fiscally, they're talking about bankruptcy of the states. The states are all in red. They've been in trouble for some time, but with this COVID, we're talking billions and trillions of dollars of red with all the states. And if they can't pay, unlike the Fed, they can't print.
Right.
Right.
So what does that mean? Like we hear if a state files bankruptcy, but what does that look like? Does that mean a drastic cuts in education, drastic cuts in workforce? Who's not going to get paid?
I'll give you an example. I was visiting University of Iowa, 1981. They had a bit of a very small, minor version of this. They had a bit of a recession going. One good Monday morning, the chair sent an email to everyone, sent a letter to everyone, saying the budget was cut, there were no more raises, buy your own pencils, and you have to pay for your own phone. The state had stopped the budget and cut the budget for the state universities right away. It's that immediate. Unlike the Fed, if you cannot print, you go bankrupt, nobody lends you. You're talking about liquidity, right? That's an insolvency. It's not just binding over from Friday to Monday, but managing your borrowing and your credit line. If you're insolvent, nobody lends you. And if you're a state, it's not a policy decision. It's a decision that is made by itself. You have no money to disperse to the police, to the hospitals, transportation, universities, all of the sources that receive funding from the state or the city will have to take a cut, not maybe, but Monday morning.
I understand that because when we talk about, you have certain states like Florida and Texas who have no income tax. And so they're they heavily depend on sales tax.
And property tax.
Sales coming.
And that's going to be reduced. They will raise the taxes. A lot of places will have value-added tax, which will further impact consumption negatively, which is the goose that lays the golden egg right now, right? So a lot of the policies that are prudent, cut expenditures and save you money and so on, also dampen consumption. And that's the thing you don't want to touch. That's the catch-22 that we have. States like Texas, I lived there for some years. They have pretty good property taxes. And those property taxes will go up. But at least that's in terms of distribution of income, that's much less regressive, as we call it, than consumption tax. Because consumption tax and value-added taxes are incredibly regressive. And if you have $1,000 to spend a month, all of it is spent on food and what you need, the basic needs, right? You pay taxes on that. If you make $20,000 a month, you may spend $2,000 on consumption. The other $18,000 isn't being taxed. So taxes on consumption are incredibly regressive. They're anti-poor in favor of well-to-do. They will go up.
Doctor, my thesis is this. A few years ago, maybe 8-10 years ago, people wanted a flat tax. And we know that a flat tax is very regressive. So what I noticed politically, what people did was they lowered property taxes, they lowered income taxes, but they started to make up those deficits with sales tax, which is another way of adding a regressive tax on poor people.
Yes, yes. And it's ironic also, certainly in terms of regressivity, there's no doubt about it, that value-added taxes are regressive in that regard. They increase inequality in a very major way. They impact the ability of the poor to save, to invest. There's nothing left to invest, to save. And it's regarded as regressive even by conservatives. Milton Friedman has a classic paper that everyone forgets, which does not sit well with his outlook economically, that shows this. An income tax is far better for the economy than a consumption tax.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because when we look at two economies that were decimated after World War II, Germany and Japan, and in order to lift themselves out of that, they had very high income taxes on the wealthiest of those people. And then from that, if you look at the German and Japan economies today, because they were able to do that, they were able to bounce back relatively quickly, as opposed to countries who refused to tax the higher end of the spectrum.
It's interesting. This is philosophical observation that I have of reading history. The capitalists are very good at shooting themselves in the foot. The Keynesian policies, which were massively adopted after the war, this Marshall Plan and so on that built Europe after the war, and in Japan, looks at the same time very consumer friendly, but that was to save the capitals. So unless people line up to buy the iPhones from you, you're not going to make any money. There are tens of thousands of inventions, brilliant ones every year, that we never hear about. Very few make it, and those are the ones that consumers adopt. Consumers make things successful. And so this business of the capital investing in what allows it to expand is very sensible, but somehow it's not very good at doing it. It's so addicted to getting it from somewhere else, or having people, its consumers are labeled to be supported by something else. It's very short-sighted, very narrow-minded. Keynes was very good at telling. Keynes is regarded as a liberal lefty economist. He was a very conservative right-wing. He was after saving the market from itself. And all of his policies are about changing so-called deficient demand. And meant, if you don't actually give this guy money, he's not going to consume your product. It's that simple an equation. And that's kind of where we are at. But by squeezing the labor, you're not really going to be helping um, consumption of goods, and that kills the need or the incentive to produce goods. And so the capital moves wherever it can find that consumer. And so my prognosis for the US is not very good because of this. The capital no longer has the same difficulty as it used to finding other markets. Capital itself already is gone. In the past, it was a question of, okay, I produce in Britain, I'm producing textiles. I have to sell it in India. Well, you can't. It's produced in England. Now it produces in India, and if Indian economy is doing well, it sells it in India. It doesn't have to worry about what to do locally.
Well, you're absolutely right. If we look at Georgia, where we had textiles, you had Dalton, one of the textile capitals of the world. But when when they were able to go and outsource that labor for cheaper labor, the capital moved, the investment moved.
It moves. You have the skilled labor, you have cheap labor, you have the large numbers, and small percentage of it becoming serious consumers is a massive replacement for Western consumption. The US's power in the world is consumption. We have a lot of economies churning because we consume what they produce. If only 1/5 of the Chinese economy, Chinese population, become serious consumers, and they're way on the way, our entire 300 million is replaced.
I understand what that means. I do.
The capitalist doesn't care who's going to pay this $133 trillion of liability in the US, because it's not going to be here picking up the pieces by the consumer here not consuming, or social unrest, depression is somewhere else. It's impacted by it because if this economy falls, I believe all the assumptions about what will happen elsewhere is endangered as well. They may have dreams about how easy that is. But I think it's a global, interconnected global economy. One domino falls, it would impact everyone else, not just economically, but in terms of social unrest, wars, and so on. So I think they miscalculate. But my point is that my reading of history is that it's not the first time that they're making this mistake. In fact, if they don't make the mistake, I hate to sound real negative here, they've never made the right decision on that historically.
I think a good example, the French Revolution, right?
All of the revolutions looked upon with a cold eye of an economist will be seen to have the same sorts of outcomes.
I have, we talked about the big picture. Let's talk about a microeconomic perspective in terms of, okay, what does this mean for me? There are two people I want to talk to. One is, okay, I have a 9-to-5 job. I'm considered middle class, you know. How does this outlook affect me? And then after that, we'll talk about the entrepreneur and what should that person be doing. So let's talk about the average American who may say their skilled profession, say, for example, a teacher. So they're college educated. They've done what America's told them to do: go to school, get an education, and maybe even not a teacher, but a nurse. You know, someone in that field. What should they be thinking, and how does this big picture really affect them?
It's a tough question because even within these groups, there's tremendous amount of what we call heterogeneity. There are people who provide basic services. You help run the government. My niece is here is a city councilwoman in Long Beach. So I know a little bit of the mechanism. My sister is a prominent nurse in Southern California. A lot of family are nurses. The police, the city service providers, utility providers. These are fundamental, the basic necessities. Will there be an impact on them if we have a sort of a depression-like outcome? Of course, the numbers, the pay, the job progression, all of those will be impacted. Another group among the younger who are relatively protected are the skilled. If I had a kid thinking about what do I do, what do I emphasize, what do I focus on learning, I would say things that are going to be skills that are required: coding, technology, finance, ironically. Skills that are marketable, they are as demanding to acquire as anything else. I always tell my kids, it's a lot easier to spend that extra 2 nights learning your calculus than being employed by someone in a factory ready with his pink slip every Monday morning to tell you whether you've done well or not. Imagine living with that news, right? So I would say some people who are involved in basic governance, basic services are relatively protected, but it's not going to be a time for growth and doing well in those areas. One thing that will impact them and everyone else is that you've noticed even when the government is issuing checks to the banks to lend, they're reluctant to lend. The lending requirements have actually tightened up in the last 2 weeks. This guy Mnuchin keeps calling and says, "It's not your money, give it away." Their instinct is not to give away money. So credit, which is the lifeblood of the reason for success of American economy history, credit is a massive component of that. You're not limited by just what you earn, is what you can pay off your future earnings. So those will be impacted for everyone. But the rich actually will suffer tremendously in terms of the paper value, the book value of what they own. Some would say, well, that's just, book value. And it's true. I don't think their consumption or the living standards will go down at all. Again, unless there's fire in the neighborhood, right? If there's fire in the neighborhood, the one with the most expensive home loses the most. So everyone is going to be impacted. So I would say that having a secure job in a required fundamental service provides a lot of safety. You mentioned entrepreneurs. This is a very, very tough time for a young entrepreneur to start. They would normally start with credit. So they're not just taking a risk, they are betting everything. And I would say if I had to start something, I would start with the skills. I mean, we have too many people sent to do what I did, just academics. In Switzerland and in Korea, they have a sort of a national exam at the 9th grade to decide who will learn skills, apprenticeships. And they have a version of this in Germany. And who would go into that pure academics. And they are doing so well, as we know. These people are paid well. They have secure skills. Those skills will always be needed. And they're real. And they're exporting, they're making things. And these are well-to-do countries. They provide for their poor, they provide health for everyone. Their retirement is secured, but their people have a lot of real skills. And I think if I had to start a business, I would go that route. Teach people coding, teach people machine tools, um, things of that kind that are geared toward the skills. You know, it's once you learn those skills, is money in the bank, and everyone needs them. All the other things that have come easy, I think, will be in jeopardy.
Dr. Essie, what would you like to close out this interview with? What are your final thoughts? Well, and let me say this too. First of all, I've enjoyed the lesson.
I've enjoyed talking to you very much.
Yeah, some of the things that we've discussed, you have reaffirmed some of my thoughts, but at the same time, you've expounded my understanding about several things. The deflation issue, you know, the investment in capital and how capital moves. And so those things, if you really get a grasp on that, then you can kind of see where things are headed. You know, I've always said that everybody needs a plumber. You know,
Yes,
that's a
exactly.
way people make money, and plumbers do very well. And it's a position where it's not glamorous, but you can save money, provide for your family, educate your kids. And so some of these things, I try to approach the municipality part, the good thing about what's happening in our city is we have enough buffer at this point in time where we won't have to do there won't be any job loss, we won't be cutting back. Um, and so we can still provide the type of services at the same level. Couple of things that we did very early on, we closed down the city and we asked that people shelter in place before the governor did. One of my concerns, which we quickly covered, was how do you feed people who are quote unquote non-essential? So those entrepreneurs who don't have the benefit of unemployment because maybe you're a hairdresser. But what we did as a city, and I'm proud of my colleagues too, we made sure we had places for people to go 5 days a week to get something to eat, you know. And so we did a very good job of that. So I'm very proud of what we're doing. But as we, you know, this 2-month loss of sales tax revenue, is going to be major. And if it continues, how does that affect our budget, you know? And so those are some of the things. But I want to leave these last thoughts with you and let you express to this community some of your thoughts about how we should navigate. What do you think is going to happen in the near term? One of the things you've expressed is, and maybe maybe it's a good time to go back and get further education. Maybe it's cheaper. You can change your skills. But I want to leave the floor to you to give us your final thoughts.
I appreciate it, Joshua. So silver linings. Jolts, shocks like this often are looked back as glorious beginnings. Recessions are highly correlated with greater education. More people actually invest in their human capital, as we call it, their education, their skills. It becomes relatively cheaper. The opportunity cost of doing it becomes smaller. So people become more skilled. You can see that it builds the welfare of the less well-off, in which I include the young. And so that's one. The other is technologically. Some fantastic new vistas are before us. I've been kind of recording my lectures at Emory for some time as an option. We had that technology. Now it's not an option. In the 80s, I put together some friends in Northern California to try to see if we can make CD-ROMs, videotape the best of my field to send all over the world, to make the best education in the US universities free, universal. We realized we didn't needed it. A special camera and a special studio, CD-ROMs couldn't take 2 hours of video, all of the stuff that wasn't my business. So I got out of that. Now, you and I forgot to record this, by the way. I hope you are.
Yeah, and I hope it turns out, but I'm definitely going to give you a copy.
So imagine you are from a less well-off community. You have certain number of responsibilities, and time allocation isn't free for you. With this business of being able to choose when you learn, how you learn, from whom you learn online, the equalization of opportunities can be spectacular. The good news is that university crowd are very receptive to this. There isn't going, certainly faculties are more than receptive to this. It's sort of what you live for. Suddenly, that beautiful lecture you gave to 9 people is forever there. It's on YouTube. You could be in some village in Tanzania or Thailand or South Central LA or in Atlanta. You can subscribe, go through those videos at your time, no matter how many times you want. Maybe register for an online tutorial with someone or someplace and pick your own time. You have your job, you have your responsibilities. At some point, you fulfill that dream. You get those sort of skills. And you pick and choose what you learn rather than being defined by a degree. You have to do this, you have to do that. So in terms of justice, in terms of equalization of opportunity, we think human capital is mother of it all. Historically, that's proven. Of all these empires out of Europe, the little places that had nothing, no resources. There's no good reason for them to have ruled the world except for human capital. That's simple. And so it's leadership, communities, and opportunities to learn, and then opportunities to use what you learn. These are going to multiply. And times like this, in a way, are very constructively destructive. Maybe the usual controls by the same owners, the same attitude, the same culture loosens or goes away. And so that creates an opportunity for a new generation. Leadership, it matters, informing people of these epochal movements. I'm really keen on that. Try to tell them what's happening, to bring them out of the blinkered. What about tomorrow? What about this? What about this happened? Those are important. Micro matters, locality matters. But I think knowing what is going on, the stuff that really determines the major things that happen locally, if people are aware, they're more likely, and more of them are more likely to take actions that would benefit them. So while the short run could be incredibly painful, I think it's foolhardy. It's the stuff about you're going back and maybe August, maybe this, maybe that. I think people are totally underestimating what's coming economically in the next 3 or 4 years without the pandemic. If this pandemic gets out of hand by premature opening, all bets are off. But what happens during this turmoil, what people do, especially in terms of building human capital, may have a massive influence on what we've all dreamed about, equalizing opportunities, making a more diverse, just world. All of these have an opportunity precisely at times like this. They have no opportunity in other circumstances. History has taught us change is incredibly painfully slow, but not with shocks like this. It took a war to recognize who was serving, and people became receptive to diversity.
Right.
They'd already diversified on who dies, who fights, right? That's what it takes.
I think
It's
that's
necessity.
I think that's a great point. And the next time we speak too, I want to talk about econometrics and talk about getting into the statistics,
You
especially
bet.
when we start talking about inequality.
You
But
bet.
I've enjoyed this conversation, and
Thoroughly here too.
yeah, let this be the first of many. And
Josh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity and I look forward to talking to you and seeing you.
I look forward to the same too. So I will
Thank you,
talk to you
Joshua.
soon, and thank you so much.
Have a great one. Happy Mother's Day.
Same to you, my friend. Same to you. Talk
Bye-bye,
to you.
Joshua.
Okay.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.
Bye-bye.